Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's the 43rd week of 2014. Aware was established 13 years ago, after the 9/11 attacks, by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic rivals in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. The U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were as much about imperial control as Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. This month, President Obama has bombed Iraq and Syria and sent dozens of drones on killing missions into AFPAC, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Of the 2,400 people killed by drone attacks in Pakistan by President Obama, only 12% have been identified as militants, and only 4% as al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, President Obama is the fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq, after George Bush I, Bill Clinton, and George Bush II. He has now bombed more countries, that is 8 countries, than George Bush ever did. He only bombed 6. Is it hard to understand how the president who came into office promising hope and change is hated around the world? The real reason for the Bush-Obama war in Afghanistan is not the war on terror, which is just an excuse. Propaganda to mislead the only enemy the U.S. government really fears, the U.S. public, who ended the war in Vietnam and drove 2 presidents from office when they stopped approving of the government's wars. There's no difference in policy between the wars of the Bush and Obama administrations, despite Obama's pretending that there was to get elected. Like Clinton and the Bushes, Obama says that he's killing people to fight terrorism. Now the ISIS group, which was originally funded and supported by principal U.S. allies in the region, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey. Obama says he's killing more people in the Mideast because ISIS threatens Americans and what he calls American interests. And that's partly true, because the principal American interest is the control of Mideast energy resources. But that's in the interest of only 1% of Americans, the rich, who profit from the U.S. control of the world economy. Obama's killing is called fighting terrorism because terrorism is the name the U.S. gives to the armed resistance, which of course can be vicious and brutal, to the generations-long U.S. invasion of the region. Even the greatest example of terrorism, the crimes of 9/11-2001, were counterattacks. Al-Qaeda said they were launched for 3 reasons. First, Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. 2, the Clinton administration's sanctions on Iraq, which killed 500,000 children, and Clinton's Secretary of State said it was worth it. And 3, Saudi Arabia's allowing U.S. troops into the Muslim Holy Land. The Obama administration is now, today, trying to rally the Sunni alliance, principally Saudi Arabia and Israel, with the threat of ISIS, the Caliphate or the Islamic State. The administration hopes to continue to use that to use the Sunni alliance, Saudi Arabia and Israel and their effective allies in the region, against what we could call the Shia alliance, that is Iran and Syria, with Russia and China in the background. But the U.S. has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And those interests are the interests of the U.S. 1% in controlling the Eurasian economy by means of controlling Mideast energy resources, the world's greatest material prize, as the State Department called it in 1945. The peace activist Kathy Kelly, who's been our guest here on this program, wrote recently, "I believe we should try very hard to hear the grievances of people in Iraq and the region, including those who have joined the Islamic State, regarding U.S. policies and wars that have radically affected their lives and well-being over the last 3 decades. It could be that many of the Iraqis who are fighting with Islamic State forces lived through Saddam Hussein's oppression when he received enthusiastic support from the U.S. during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Many may be survivors of the U.S. Desert Storm bombing in 1991, which destroyed every electrical facility across Iraq. When the U.S. insisted on opposing crushing and murderous economic sanctions on Iraq for the next 13 years, these sanctions directly contributed to the deaths of 500,000 children under age 5. The UN observers for that, the Clinton-era sanctions on Iraq, both quit the job on the grounds that what the Clinton American administration was doing was genocide. The children who died should have been teenagers or in their early 20s by now. Are some of the Islamic State fighters the brothers or cousins of the children who were punished to death by economic sanctions? Presumably many of these fighters lived through the U.S.-led 2003 shock and awe invasion and bombing of Iraq, and the chaos the U.S. chose to create afterwards by using a war-shattered country as some sort of free market experiment, or at least that's what they said they were doing. They've endured the repressive corruption of the regime the U.S. helped install in Saddam's place. The United Nations should take over the response to the Islamic State, and people should continue to pressure the U.S. and its allies to leave the response not merely to the UN, but to its most democratic constituent body, the General Assembly. But facing the bloody mess that has developed in Iraq and Syria, I think Archbishop Romero's exhortation to the Salvadoran soldiers during the Carter-Reagan wars on Latin America pertains directly to U.S. people. To slightly rewrite the words, Kathy Kelly proposes to rewrite Archbishop Romero's address to the people in those days and address it now to us. Quote, "I want to make a special appeal to the people of the United States. Each of you is one of us. The peoples you kill are your own brothers and sisters. When you hear a person telling you to kill, remember God's words, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey a law contrary to the law of God. In the name of God, in the name of our tormented people, I beseech you, I implore you, I command you to stop the repression." Close quote. Archbishop Romero in El Salvador. A few weeks later, he was shot by an American agent while he was saying Mass in San Salvador. The war on the Islamic State will distract us from what the U.S. has done and is doing to create further despair in Iraq and to enlist new recruits for the Islamic State. The Islamic State is the echo of America's bombing and invasion of Iraq. The emergency today is not the Islamic State, but war. Close quote. Kathy Kelly, noted peace activist. It's not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans to kill people around the world for the profits of the 1%. But that's what the American government is doing, up to and including President Obama's administration. In 1967, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King admitted with dismay that, quote, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government," close quote. Tragically, nothing has changed in the intervening years. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases outside its borders. Russia has 11. China has 1. The U.S. Special Operations Command, a 63,000-member private army that reports to the U.S. President's National Security Council, not to Congress, is active by its own admission in 124 countries around the world. Its activities include rendition, that's kidnapping, enhanced interrogation, that's torture, and disposition, that's murder. Read about the CIA's disposition matrix. Last year, President Obama told White House aides, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. Obama has killed some 5,000 people with drones alone, including 200 children. The unavoidable conclusion is that the Obama administration wants war in the Mideast. not just for the profits of the arms makers, although that's an important consideration for the U.S. government, but because otherwise there's no propaganda justification for U.S. military control of the region. You're watching Aware on the Air. Aware wants to stop the child killers in the White House and the Congress in their efforts around the world on behalf of the American 1%. We try to do this by exposing the real story of what's going on over against the false account that the U.S. media, a creation of big business, want you to believe. We'll challenge that false account tonight with commentaries by Ron Szoke on a policeman's lot, David Swanson on a National Day of Action against police brutality, and Jeffrey St. Clair on a short history of escalating police violence. And we'll begin with Ron Szoke, a policeman's lot. It's not a happy one, Ron? Is that the way it goes?
Well, yes. In certain respects, it is a happy one, because as it turns out, you can kill people and take their property with a great deal of impunity. And how did that come about? Well, that's a rather startling claim on my part, but I'll proceed to document it with a piece from the New York Times by Brent Staples on October 10th, titled Race and Death in Police Shootings. The death this summer of Michael Brown, a black 18-year-old from Ferguson, Missouri, raised fresh questions about how often black men and boys die at the hands of the police and whether or not death rates differ by race. ProPublica, the public interest news organization, provides some alarming, data-driven answers in a grim report issued earlier today. An analysis of federally collected data showed that young black males in recent years were at far greater risk of being shot dead by police than their white counterparts, 21 times greater. According to the report, the 1,217 deadly police shootings from 2010 to 2012 captured in the federal data show that blacks aged 15 to 19 were killed at a rate of 31.17 per million, while just 1.47 per million white males in that age range died at the hands of police. Black boys killed by the police can be frighteningly young. There were 41 teens, 14 years or younger, reported killed by officers from 1980 to 2012. 27 of them were black, 8 were white, 4 were Hispanic, and 1 was Asian. Who kills all these black men and boys? The article asks. Mostly white officers, but in hundreds of instances, black officers too. Black officers count for a little more than 10% of all the fatal police shootings. Of those they kill, though, 78% were black. 2/3 of the teens whom police said were killed while fleeing, quoting, fleeing or resisting arrest were black. It's a classic line, of course, used by prison guards when they want to dispose of someone. He was caught, shot while escaping, or trying to escape. These data explain why the black and white communities generally have starkly different views of the police. They also show why African American parents warn their sons to remain perfectly still and to make no sudden moves when they encounter the police. As the expression goes in the black world, don't give them an excuse to kill you. Indeed, it's a classic. Whenever a white officer shoots and kills a young black man, he just has to say, well, I thought I saw him going for a gun. And it typically turns out there is no gun. There may be a cell phone or a candy bar or something, but there was no weapon. And but again and again, police officers have been attaining a vacation with pay after they do that, because other law enforcement and juries will typically say, well, we may not fully believe their story, but we can't proceed against this officer whose duty is to serve and protect, and he thought he was doing the right thing. Another article from the Washington Post on October 11th, asset seizures fuel police spending. Police agencies have used hundreds of millions of dollars taken from Americans under federal civil forfeiture law in recent years to buy guns, armored cars, and electronic surveillance gear. They have also spent money on luxury vehicles, travel, and a clown named Sparkles. The details are contained in thousands of annual reports submitted by local and state agencies to the Justice Department's Equitable Sharing Program, an initiative that allows local and state police to keep up to 80% of the assets they seize. The Washington Post obtained 43,000 of the reports, dating from 2008 through a Freedom of Information Act request. The documents offer a sweeping look at how police departments and drug task forces across the country are benefiting from laws that allow them to take cash and property without proving a crime has occurred. The law was meant to decimate drug organizations, but the Post found that it has been used as a routine source of funding for law enforcement at every level. In tight budget periods and even in times of budget surpluses, using asset forfeiture dollars to purchase equipment and training to stay current with the ever-changing trends in crime fighting helps serve and protect the citizens, said a police spokeswoman. Brad Cates, a former director of asset forfeiture programs at the Justice Department, said the spending identified by the Post suggests police are using equitable sharing, that's the name of the program, as a free-floating slush fund. Cates, who oversaw the program while at Justice from 1985 to 89, said it has enabled police to sidestep the traditional budget process in which elected leaders create law enforcement spending priorities. Of the nearly $2.5 billion in spending reported on the forms, 81% came from cash and property seizures in which no indictment was filed, according to the analysis by the Post owners. By the Post, owners must prove that the money or property was acquired legally in order to get it back, and that will take a very long time and a good deal of money going through that process, even if it was not legitimately seized. The police purchases comprise a rich mix of the practical and the high-tech, including an array of gear that has helped some departments militarize their operations. A good deal of that equipment, of course, as we've learned earlier, they can get for free, but other equipment they can buy. Humvees, automatic weapons, gas grenades, night vision scopes, and sniper gear. Many departments acquired electronic surveillance equipment, including automated license plate readers and systems that track cell phones. This spending also included a $5 million helicopter for the Los Angeles police, a mobile command bus worth more than $1 million for Prince George's County, an armored personnel character costing $227,000 in Douglasville, Georgia, population 32,000. $5,300 worth of challenge coin medallions in Brunswick County, North Carolina. $4,600 for a Sheriff's Award banquet by the Doñana County, New Mexico Sheriff's Department, and a $637 coffee maker for the Randall County Sheriff's Department in Amarillo, Texas. Sparkles the Clown was hired with asset forfeiture proceeds by police in the village of Remindersville, Ohio, where she painted clowns' faces at a community relations event. Sparkles the Clown was hired for $225 by Chief Jeff Buck to improve community relations, but Buck said the seizure money had been crucial to sustaining long-term investigations that have put thousands of drug traffickers in prison. The police in Ferguson, Missouri also participate in equitable sharing. Since 2008, the department reported using seizure proceeds to buy $18,000 in weapons and protective gear, $71,000 in computers and communications gear, and about $43,000 in electronic surveillance equipment. Some of the money was seized in partnerships with other agencies, the reports show. So I'll drop that topic for now, and perhaps we can come back to it later.
We have Sparkles the Clown on our Halloween show.
Yeah,
I think that's an invitation we should issue.
And this extends, of course, to the USA, which now considers itself the policeman of the world, essentially, the indispensable nation, despite all the denials that you hear. That seems to be the reality of the situation. But for now, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. It seems clear that the one immediate conclusion of these horrific facts that you set out is the necessity to abolish the war on drugs. It's important, I think, that the only political party or political group on the American scene that's really calling for an abolition of the war on drugs is the Libertarians. That raises some other questions about what the Libertarian Party represents, what jobs it's being given to do by the American political establishment. But the assault on the war on drugs is certainly something that we should take very seriously.
Have the Greens taken a position on it?
On the war on drugs, yes, but not they. I think they're, and they have explicitly said for a long time that they support and agree with the Libertarians on this point. There is another aspect of it, though. You can't really stop the war on drugs and without decriminalizing most of the things that are, indeed all of the things, all the substances that are concerned in the war on drugs. And a lot of people who think, well, there certainly have been excesses in the war on drugs, aren't willing to go that far. We have some examples which are rarely talked about of what decriminalization of all drugs would mean, most notably Portugal. There's been almost a generation-long experiment in Portugal now. To call it an experiment is it's a social policy to decriminalize drugs, and it's been a smashing success. It's a success that we don't hear talked about in the American media very much, or if at all, in part because of the disdain towards foreigners, particularly foreigners in the southern arc of Europe, and also because it's a success. And that's not a story that most American media and most American political groups want to hear. You're listening to Aware on the Air. You're watching Aware on the Air. And we are talking today particularly about the fact that there is a National Day of Action tomorrow concerning police brutality. I'm not aware of any activities actually going on in our community, but October 22nd has been designated by some groups across the country as a day of concern with police brutality. And the horrific examples that Ron adduced a moment ago, and the things we've seen from Ferguson, Missouri, and from St. Louis, and many other countries, many other cities across the country, show us the necessity for a national day of action against police brutality. There's a note by David Swanson, who is a longtime peace activist, about this matter that I want to read and ask for Ron's comments on. Swanson writes, "This Wednesday is a day of action that some are calling a national day of action against police brutality, with others adding, and mass incarceration. As Ron has pointed out on this issue before, the U.S. imprisons more of its fellow citizens per capita than any country in the world, including Russia and China and South Africa, etc. This Tuesday, today, the governor of Pennsylvania is due to sign a bill that will silence prisoners' speech. Mumia Abu-Jamal gave a commencement address at Goddard College. Obviously, he did it by electronic communications because he's in jail. He's in prison. And the outcry was so great, and it was done in a contemporary sort of R2P fashion, that what he said would cause distress to the relatives of the policeman whom he shot. So the Pennsylvania legislature said, and immediately passed a law denying free speech rights to prisoners. A movement is coalescing around reforming police procedures and taking away their military weapons. A very good article you can find on the web by Brian Dolliner of this community about the sheriff of Champaign County, and his MRAP is worth looking at. And a powerful book has just been published called Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. Saving Trayvon Martin would have required systematic reforms or cultural reforms beyond putting cameras on police officers. This young man walking back from a store with candy was spotted by an armed man in an SUV who got out of his vehicle to pursue Trayvon despite having been told not to when he called the police. George Zimmerman was not a police officer, though he wanted to be one. He'd lost a job as a security guard for being too aggressive. He'd been arrested for battery on a police officer. He had left Manassas, Virginia, and its climate of hatred for Latinos, in which he participated, for Florida, where he was a one-man volunteer neighborhood watch group in a gated community. He'd phoned the police on 46 previous occasions. He apparently expressed his contempt for Trayvon Martin in racist terms. When the police arrived, they let Zimmerman ride in the front seat, no handcuffs, of course, and never tested him for drugs, testing instead the dead black boy he'd murdered. When public outrage finally put Zimmerman on trial, his defense displayed a photo of a white woman living in the neighborhood who had nothing to do with the incident, but who was used to represent what Zimmerman had been defending. Zimmerman was found innocent. Killing Trayvons, the book, is a rich anthology including police records, trial transcripts, statements by President Obama, accounts of numerous similar cases, essays, poetry, and history and analysis of how we got here and how we might get the hell out of here, writes David Swanson. Recently, he says, I was playing a game with my little boy that must have looked to any observer like I was secretly spying on people. I found myself thinking that it was a good thing I wasn't black, or I'd risk someone reporting me to the police, and I'd find myself struggling to explain the situation to them rather than yelling at them, and they wouldn't listen. What do I tell my son, wrote Talib Calloway. He's 5 years old, and he's still thinking cops are cool. How do I break the news when he gets some size? He'll be perceived as a threat and see the fear in their eyes. I remember a character of James Baldwin's explaining to a younger brother on the streets of New York that when walking in the rich part of town, you must always keep your hands in your pockets so as not to be accused of touching a white woman. But a set of rules designed by Ethan Thomas in Killing Trayvons includes keep your hands visible, avoid putting them in your pockets. Opposite advice, same injustice. I can recall how offended I was when, as a young white man, I became old enough for a strange woman in a deserted place to hurry away from me in panic. Maybe if I'd been black, someone would have prepared me for that. Maybe I'd have experienced it a lot earlier. Maybe I'd have experienced it as racist. Maybe it would have been. But would I have come around to the conclusion, as I have, that there's nothing I have a right to be indignant about? That people's fear, wherever it comes from, is more important to reduce than other people's annoyance? But what about fear that leads to murder? What about white fear of black violence that leads to the killing of so many African Americans, and many of them women, suggesting that fear isn't all there is to it? Police and security guards kill hundreds of African Americans each year, most of them unarmed. In most cases, the killers claim to have felt threatened. In most cases, they escape any accountability. Clearly, this is a case of fear to be doubted and treated with appropriate skepticism, fear to be understood and sympathized with where real, but fear never to be respected as reasonable or justified. We need a combination of addressing the fear through enlightenment and impeding the violence with application of the rule of law in a manner that does not treat murdering black kids as what any reasonable person would do. We need to rein in and hold accountable individuals and institutions, groups like the NRA and ALEC that push racist policies on us. Police and neighbors should not see a black boy as an intruder in his own house. Chiefs of police in Champaign-Urbana should not shoot black kids for being uppity. They shouldn't spray chemical weapons in someone's face before asking him questions. The editors of Killing Trayvons, Kevin Alexander Gray, Jeffrey Sinclair, and Joanne Wipajewski, put killing in context. What if Trayvon actually got into a fight with his stalker superhero? Would that have been a good reason to kill him? It takes a jacked-up disdain for proportionality to conclude the execution is a reasonable response to a fistfight. And yet, high or low, power teaches such disdain every day. Lose 2 towers, destroy 2 countries. Lose 3 Israelis, kill a couple of thousand Palestinians. Sell some dope, 3 strikes, you're out. Sell a Lucy, choke, you're dead. Reach for your wallet, bang, you're dead. Got a beef, hang, you're dead. This is exactly the problem. High and low include Supreme Courts that kill black men like Troy Davis, and presidents who kill dark-skinned Muslim foreigners, some of them U.S. citizens, with drones, leading Vijay Prashad to call Zimmerman a domestic drone, and Cornel West to call President Obama a global Zimmerman. 2 bizarre varieties of murder have been legalized at the same time in the United States. One is stand-your-ground killing, justified by fear and applied on a consistently racist basis. The other is drone missile killing, justified by fear and applied on a consistently racist basis. Both types of murder are much more obviously murder than any other instances that have not been given blanket legalization. Stand-your-ground murders are facilitated by racism, and racist propaganda that blames the victims protects the killers after the fact. Drone murders are driven by profit, politics, power lust, and racism, and the guilt of President Obama is sheltered by the prevalence of racist hatred for him, which comes from generally the same group of people who support stand-your-ground laws. How can Obama be guilty of any wrong in overseeing a global kill list when racists hate him? Millions of Americans think of themselves as above the ignorant whites who fear every black person they see, and yet have swallowed such a fear of ISIS that even giving ISIS a war it wants and benefits from seems justified. After all, ISIS is barbaric. If it were civilized, ISIS wouldn't behead people. It would have the hostages commit suicide while handcuffed in the back seat of police cars. That's David Swanson on the connections, and unfortunately they are as sharp as he suggests, between police brutality in the United States and Obama's war in the Middle East. We should see that connection and indeed do something about it. You're watching Aware on the Air. I'm Carl Estabrook. Ron, comments on this?
Yes, I think it indicates in part the broader cultural shift to what I call subjectivism and the appeal to my feelings or supposed feelings as justification for whatever I do, which may include killing people who make me feel uncomfortable or unsafe. And that kind of talk is turning up again and again. There's this enormous movement now to take into account victim statements of people who are related somehow to crime victims, murder victims in particular, and to for them to start demanding closure, which means kill that guy, and it'll make me feel better. And the whole issue then becomes my feelings, my precious and holy feelings. And the gimmick, of course, is that I'm the only one who knows what my feelings are. I am the ultimate unimpeachable authority on that. And if my feelings are such of fear or retaliation or whatever, then that's the all-sufficient justification for killing you or for doing whatever else I want to do. So we have the policeman who shot to death Mr. Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, now claiming, which has become standard in these trials, I was fearing for my life. I was afraid for my life. After which, well, he actually got out of the car and shot 6 bullets into Mr. Brown from about 30 feet away, according to eyewitnesses, but is still trying to use the line that I was afraid for my life. So what leads to this emphasis on feelings? Whose feelings are to have supremacy here? We never hear very much about the feelings of the people, the groups that are being oppressed and shot, of course. You see it again and again in reporting from Israel, Palestine. Lots of reports about the feelings of the Israelis who are being shot at with the rockets from Gaza. But when do you ever hear anything about the feelings of the Palestinians who are on the other end of that, who have nothing to do actually with the rockets from Hamas, but are feeling the brunt of the mass killing and destruction carried out by Israel in Gaza just a few weeks ago? So how did feelings get to be the paramount thing in our culture? Well, I have a theory about that too. It's a result of advertising and constant appeal to how you feel about yourself and the subjectivism implied in it. You deserve the very best. You need this. Again, the disregard for the objective facts of the case. If there are more instances of people saying, well, I felt afraid, I thought I saw him going for a gun and so on, there had better be a serious inquiry about whether there really is a gun. And sometimes that occurs, but more often it's just discounted as irrelevant or of no great significance, whether there actually was a weapon or not. So there's another whole philosophical theory that goes with this about a culture and a society cannot be maintained on the basis of people's subjective feelings about things. And the Butler University philosopher Elijah Jordan had a good deal to say about this, including in his book, Business Be Damned. But that would lead us off into another direction. Maybe I'll return to it.
It's an important and interesting point, Ron, and it ramifies, I think, the recent dispute at the University of Illinois about the egregious violation of academic freedom and the firing of a professor of indigenous studies.
Right.
Had to do with the feelings that you speak of. The notion was that this guy could be fired because he had said things in emails that might make some students feel bad if expressed in the classroom.
Yeah.
Now, this is quite remarkable. I mean, you know, part of the problem is it's whole cloth. It's made up. I mean, it's made up because of the content of the feelings that he was expressing, the attack on the crimes of Israel and the support for them by the United States, which is not to be heard on American campuses these days as a result of an amazing campaign against free speech on American campuses. But once again, this the trigger, as you say, the trigger is, as you say, this notion of feelings, as it is for a number of other discussions about trigger alerts in college teaching. I mean, it is truly amazing that this excuse can be used as it is for so many nefarious political purposes. David Swanson began the article that I just read with a reference to a law being signed by the governor of Pennsylvania today that cuts off free speech rights of prisoners. And the reason for the law was that Mumia Abu-Jamal gave a commencement address electronically to Goddard College, and in that address it was said by representatives in the state legislature, he probably made the relatives of the policeman he was convicted of killing feel bad that he was speaking publicly. So here, once again, you know, the subjectivism that you're talking. I mean, what they were actually doing, of course, was trying to prevent Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is an eloquent spokesman for some of the very issues we're talking about today, to prevent that sort of speech. So they wave aside any notions of freedom of speech, any constitutional guarantees, and pass a law saying because of the feelings of the victims' families, this man shall not be given any free speech. It's a dodge. It's a cover story, but nevertheless, it's one that, as you point out, is being frequently used. We're talking today about the connection between the war in the Middle East and the war at home, the police brutality that has become so shocking an example of contemporary American society. I read David Swanson's account that began with reference to a book recently published by the Counterpunch group. The book is called Killing Trayvons, and it's edited by the editor of Counterpunch, Jeffrey Sinclair, and colleagues. Sinclair himself had a piece this week entitled A Short History of Escalating Police Violence. I want to turn to that. Mark the date, he writes, on August 13th, America woke to learn the hard truth. Its police departments, from bucolic hamlets in the rural Midwest to seething metropolises, had become militarized. The primetime revelations came as a relief to white liberal commentators who felt much more comfortable denouncing troopers in body armor than probing the racist nature of policing in America. Moreover, it gave MSNBC's hipster newshound, Chris Hayes, the opportunity to play war correspondent, reporting nightly from the, quote, combat zone, close quote. He was talking about Ferguson, Missouri. The arc of the story peddled by the press was that the militarization of America's police departments was a largely post-9/11 phenomenon, another menacing legacy of, wait for it, the Bush years. Of course, this is a ludicrously warped reading of history. This is Jeffrey Sinclair writing this piece for Counterpunch. He says, I still have vivid flashbacks of my own close encounter with soldier cops on the streets of Seattle in the fall of 1999, ducking my head under fire from rubber-coated bullets, exploding tear gas canisters, and concussion grenades. A few months later, a similar scene of mayhem played out in Washington, D.C. during the IMF World Bank demonstrations, where, as Joanne Wipajewski reported at the time, the police snipers were issued shoot-to-kill orders. Alexander Coburn used to say that you can only take the ruling class off guard once every decade or so before they rearm and escalate their techniques of political repression. In truth, the police have always been militarized. In 1914, local cops, private security forces, and the National Guard, acting to defend the investments of John D. Rockefeller, opened fire with machine guns on striking coal miners and their families in Ludlow, Colorado, killing 26 people, including 2 women and 11 children. The weapon of choice for the paramilitaries at Ludlow's was a Gatling gun, which strafed the strikers and their families at the rate of 200 rounds a minute. In the fall of 1919, the Federal Department of Justice unleashed raids on Russian immigrants, unionists, and suspected anarchists across the United States under orders from Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Armed with automatic, this was the Wilson administration, by the way, armed with automatic weapons, Palmer's men, led by the young J. Edgar Hoover, swept up more than 10,000 people in dozens of violent raids. These savage actions were heartily endorsed at the time by the Washington Post, then a leading purveyor of Bolshevik fear-mongering, which impatiently noted, quote, "There is no time to waste on hair-splitting over infringement of civil liberties," close quote, the Washington Post. In 1921, General John T. Thompson invented the Thompson submachine gun, or Tommy gun, the most lethal firearm of its time, which was capable of firing 1,000 rounds per minute. The first sales of the so-called Annihilator weapons were to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. They were afraid you might get a copy of Ulysses or Lady Chatterley's Lover or something, and they had the guns ready. The gun was soon marketed to police forces across the country, and by 1933 had become a standard weapon in the arsenal of Hoover's FBI. Today's FBI SWAT teams are armed with MP510 submachine guns, M4 carbine rifles, M1911A1 Springfield pistols, 40 caliber Glocks, Remington 12-gauge shotguns, stun guns, tasers, and grenades. The people at Waco and Ruby Ridge never stood a chance. It should come as no surprise that these violent police tactics have been used most viciously against black radicals. Take the murders of Black Panthers Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in 1969. And by the way, I had just arrived in the Midwest. That was my introduction to the Midwest, the news of the murders of Hampton and Clark in the fall of 1969. In the early morning hours of November 4th, a 14-man special prosecutions unit composed of Chicago police and FBI agents invaded Hampton's apartment, guns firing. Clark was shot and killed while sitting in a chair. Hampton was shot multiple times while asleep in his bed. Earlier in the evening, he had been slipped a large dose of secobarbital by an FBI informant named William O'Neill. The wounded Hampton was dragged from his bed and into the hallway, where he was killed with 2 shots to the head. The police officers who murdered Hampton and Clark were exonerated by a grand jury. The only regret offered by the FBI agent on the scene, Greg York, was that more Panthers weren't in the room at the time of the hit. Quote, "We expected about 20 Panthers to be in the apartment when the police raided the place. Only 2 of those black niggers were killed, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark," close quote from the FBI. Cut to 1985 in West Philadelphia. The black liberation group MOVE had established a commune and organic gardens in the neighborhood of row houses on Osage Avenue. After numerous clashes with neighbors and police, Philadelphia police launched a raid on the MOVE building that culminated with a police helicopter dropping a water gel bomb supplied by the FBI on the building. The TNT-like explosive ignited a huge blaze that burned down the MOVE building and 60 other houses and killed 11 people, including MOVE's leader John Africa and 5 children, and so on and so on. Meanwhile, back in Ferguson, what about the murder of Michael Brown? The repellent circumstances of his death were largely eclipsed by the orgiastic coverage of the police response to 10 days of rather placid protests, where Al Sharpton, FBI snitch, played his usual role as pacifier of public outrage. There did come news that Brown's killer had received more than $250,000 in donation from Fox News watchers, many of whom likely wished they could have been riding shotgun in that cop car and pulled the trigger themselves. Mike Brown wasn't shot by a SWAT team or a sniper or an AK-47. He was murdered in a more banal and insidious manner, the way most black men are killed, at the rate of 1 every 2.5 days, by cops and vigilantes in America. Brown was gunned down on a neighborhood street by an unremarkable patrol officer performing his nightly duty to harass and intimidate black men, who were viewed almost at the moment of their birth as enemies of the state. This is the ghastly reality that the Pharisees of the press refuse to confront. Am I alone, writes Jeffrey Sinclair, in feeling unsettled by the image adopted by the protesters on Ferguson streets of citizens with their hands upraised in a posture of submission and surrender to authority? Hands up, don't shoot. It's surely a long way from the Black Power salute with the raised and clenched fist. I much prefer the video of Mike Brown in that convenience store, a burly, confident teenager, pulsing with the arrogance of youth. I imagine him when he was accosted, turning toward that cop and saying with a gesture of defiance, "You don't have the right." That's Jeffrey Sinclair writing in Counterpunch about his the new book that he has edited called Killing Trayvons. And I recommend the book, which I have just got, and the accounts we've heard today from David Swanson and Jeffrey Sinclair himself give you some sense of what's going on there. In this day before a scheduled National Day of Action against police brutality, which, as David Swanson points out, is directly bound up with the war that the Obama administration is conducting in the Middle East and continues to conduct, although we keep hearing talk about how it's being drawn down. You're watching Aware on the Air. I'm Carl Estabrook. Ron, comments on this?
No, I think it's time for some soul searching about a lot of this stuff. What we've done to remove all constraints from the police, why it is that cities and states are unable or unwilling to control them. The New York City police force, for example, is notoriously inclined to abuse people. The stop and frisk law has been ended, at least partially, by Mayor de Blasio, but some people are complaining now that it's led to an increase in crime in New York City, and they may bring it back. But I think there are other deeper causes and tendencies at work here, and we'll see how that goes. There won't be time, I think, to go into other topics that I view as somewhat related, but that may not be obvious, including an important article in the New York Times, October 19th, The Reign of Terror. A retired professor of philosophy at Northern Illinois University, Thomas Capitan, who analyzes at length the uses of the word terror, terrorist, terrorism, and so on, and how they're being used as more and more as a justification for everything, including a lot of killing and political repression and so on. And how loose our language has become in this respect. We're killing suspected militants, for example, in the Middle East, but a lot of people are being arrested and prosecuted on the basis of suspicion. And again, there's the subjectivism of that. I can be suspicious of anyone for anything, and it's rarely required that to be able to show any actual objective, real-world basis for that suspicion. So the question is, the issue is this something just in my own mind? And more, the killers are pleading this, that offering this as justification. I felt afraid, and so on. I am afraid we've gone too far in that direction, and we're seeing the consequences of it in the real world out there, quite apart from any thoughts or feelings or emotions that I might have.
One final comment on this issue. This matter is discussed sometimes these days as if it were an argument about the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the amendment that's always quoted as the right to bear arms. I want to suggest that maybe that is the argument we should be having, not whether the Second Amendment should be repealed or not, but what the Second Amendment actually says and what that implies about our political practice. The amendment reads, I quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The second clause is the one that's focused on usually, but I suggest we focus on the first clause as well. A well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Now, when that was written, the militia was the armed body of citizens in an American community. The armed body of citizens included a variety of citizens, not a specialized professional group. But it's clear that the specialized professional group, the modern police forces, inherit the function of the militia in 18th century America. So when the Second Amendment makes a constitutional right to a well-regulated militia, because it's necessary to the security of a free state, what we have here is a fundamental charter for the control of the police, for what are properly called civil review boards, not civilian review boards, which implies the police are military. Civil review boards with teeth. The city of Urbana, for example, has a civil review board, but it hasn't many teeth. And the right of the people to control their police forces is clearly set out in the Second Amendment and rarely alluded to. But we should make that a basis for controlling the police forces, indeed perhaps disarming them on the British model and moving away from the militarization that has suddenly been noticed in some quarters.
Yeah, let's start asking, what part of well-regulated don't you understand?
Exactly. I think that's a very good way to put it. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 43rd week of 2014. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett for Urbana Public Television, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware, where we'll post some of the articles we've been referring to today. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about all too well, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, James Risen, and others, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, David Johnson, David Green, Yakov Ziso, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.